사방팔방.
All right. Hey guys, welcome back to the Korean Always podcast. My name is Ademola and here with my boy George. We're back with an episode about a very relatively controversial topic in the Korean language learning community, and that is Hanja.
Yeah, so guys, in today's video, we're going to be covering a wide range of topics, starting from whether Hanja is worth learning, why we chose to learn it, which ones do you need to know, what is the best way to learn them, with Anki and all these other programs, how does knowing them actually benefit you, and finally, traditional versus simplified, what's the difference, and how does it work in Korean society. So with that said, now I'm going to start and ask sort of the first question. Ademola, how did you go about learning Hanja? Why did you even bother trying to learn it? Give us a little spin on that, please.
Yeah, actually, funny enough, the real biggest influence on me learning Hanja was this man right here. George is the person who actually got me in on the Hanja gang. Because I won't lie, in the very beginning, oftentimes people say, when you speak to the average Korean person, how much do I need to learn Hanja? Hanja is one of those things that when it comes to Korean relative to other Eastern Asian languages like Japanese and Chinese, it's present in all three. But specifically for Korean, I'd always heard like, oh, you don't need to learn it. Like, it's not important. Like, Hanja's nowhere. It's never. You don't need to worry about Hanja at all. So with that, I was like, oh, really? Okay, well then I guess I'll forget about it. Mm-hmm. But then I met George, and George kind of actually introduced me to like, oh, Hanja is where it's at, man. Like, Hanja is legendary. And it was after we kind of talked about it, and I saw like how crazy excited George was about Hanja, that George actually shared with me like the importance of Hanja in learning Korean, or at least how it can be helpful. So George, how about you? How did you start learning Hanja?
Yeah, so when I started learning Korean, of course, I didn't know that much about it, but I had an idea because I studied Japanese a little bit. So I knew kind of how they worked, and I'd already sort of done a bit of kanji practice, which is, if you don't know, is Japanese sort of the word for Hanja in Japanese, the Chinese characters. So first of all, the word Hanja is just Chinese characters. It's Hanzi in Chinese, not with that tone, but something like that. But anyway, I had a background in those characters, and I thought, the day I found out that they were used in Korean, I thought, well, this is just genius. Like, it just looks so cool that I just want to learn it anyway, regardless whether it's useful or not. And I found out that in Korea, they use them for all of their words, because the words are sort of cognates of Chinese, or not cognates, but they come from Chinese, and it becomes quite useful to know them in terms of vocabulary building. So the reason I actually started was mainly to improve my vocabulary, but mostly because I just thought the characters looked cool, and I thought it might come in handy someday if I perhaps learn another language, or even just go to Chinatown or something like that. You can still work out the characters. But yeah, I would say they are actually worth learning in that respect because of the sheer amount of vocab that you can just. Of course, you can do this, without Hanja. I'm not saying that you only need to learn Hanja and that's the sort of be all and end all for everyone. But I strongly advise you to learn the basic ones, and you can see this process take place for yourself. So the process I'm talking about here is vocabulary in Korean is all based. Well, I say all. 70% of it is based off of Hanja, which the words are. It's kind of like compounds, how we have in Latin. So maybe like aquarium, like aqua, something to do with like water, right? So that kind of thing. In Korean, there's mulsu, which is the character, so for water, right? So they call it by what it actually is, and then it has its like pronunciation. So mul in Korean is just water. If you say it to someone, it means water. But if you say su to someone, they're like, what does that mean? That doesn't really mean anything because it's just the pronunciation. It's like saying, walking up to someone and saying aqua. Doesn't really make sense, right? So that's just a little small explanation just for those guys who don't really know. But that is definitely worth it.
Was it like, I know you said something like how you had an idea of what Hanja was, because for the most part, when I started learning Hanja, or at least before I started learning Korean or really got into like what Hanja was, when I saw Hanja, I was like, oh, that's just Chinese. Like why would I be? I'm not learning Chinese.
Yeah,
why do I need to learn Hanja?
Why did you not want to learn it, kind of thing? I want to understand it from your point, because I've always been about it.
Yeah. It was weird. It wasn't like I didn't want to learn it, but for the most part, it was like when it comes to Korean language acquisition, for the most part, that I had understood was Hanja is like an additive. Like it's one of those
Yeah,
things that once you're really good,
not
then you
necessarily.
can
Yeah.
start studying if you want. It's not necessarily something that is required for you to reach a certain level of Korean fluency.
Mm.
And with my goal in mind was, okay, I want to try and get as good at speaking Korean and understanding Korean as possible.
Mm.
Obviously, first with the understanding, I was like, I
Yeah,
mean, I'm not reading these Hanja characters in the first place because, I mean,
yeah.
for the most part, in most shows that you're watching, you're
They
not
don't
going to
really come
see
up.
Hanja.
Yeah,
Hanja doesn't
yeah.
really come up. But then there's some moments where, like in Yenin, in like variety shows, or
Yes, yes.
obviously on the news, most
Yeah,
specifically,
news
the news,
specifically.
like
That's
if
the
you
word.
watch the news for like a couple hours, you'll see like hella Hanja.
Yeah.
Like that was one thing that I noticed.
Mm.
And
Or
it
even,
was
yeah.
it was like
The,
right in that period where I started like watching the news that I was like, oh, okay, Hanja's definitely used more than I thought. But I
mm,
mean, for you, I know when you were in Korea, how
right.
much Hanja were you seeing on like a daily basis? Or
Well, I would say I would see it at least once a day because every on my road there was like a Korean restaurant where it had the name in Hanja. It's called like
oh, okay,
Darak. So like manita, like a lot of and like as in
mm,
orak, like enjoyment kind
right,
of thing. Um,
mm,
but yeah, so I'd see it every day. But I suppose if I was not living there, I think living in Seoul, yeah, you will see at least a character a day, at least like on some sign
mm,
somewhere. And another thing that I just sort of that comes to mind as well, you said that they don't really get used much in real life. One place where they always are used is on like tombstones and gravestones, or like if someone's passed away, they have like
oh,
go something something, go being like
oh,
marking that they're dead, they're deceased. So there is
mm,
one. There are actually a few that you do definitely need to know regardless. So the ones for like small, medium, and large.
yeah, so
중대,
Jung,
also 대 중소,
yeah,
going large to
right,
small.
right,
Um, which you'll see on a menu, perhaps even in I don't know a Korean restaurant, they might have like large portion, small portion, but they write it fancily in Hanja because everyone knows those. But
ah,
obviously, foreigners may not learn them. So that you do, yeah, they do pop up in life from time to time, but not
mm,
absolutely essential. But like I'm saying,
mm,
native speakers will know a fair few. Say
right,
let's just throw a number 50 to 100. They will know that like indefinitely. Um,
yeah,
but then going
and
on
I
from
guess,
there, it's
mhm,
like which ones do you need to know? I mean, we can get onto that in a second.
right.
But if there's anything else you want to add there,
And I mean, I guess moving into like which ones you need to know. I
yeah,
guess like how many like I think I read somewhere that the average Korean student like they study Hanja like the first I think
yes,
it's like 1,800 like essential Hanja is the way it's put. Like essential
hmm
Hanja is what's studied in school. But it's funny because like when I had like conversations with Korean people, I'm like, oh, like do you know like these Hanja? And they're like, oh, don't study that. You don't need to know that. No one uses it. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like it's one of those things like why are Korean people telling me not to study it? You know?
yeah,
But I mean,
yeah,
as
yeah,
far as the ones that we need to know, because
hmm
in a way, like I've started studying Hanja, and the weird thing is like after starting to study Hanja, I've noticed how much easier it is to learn new word, like especially with our vocabulary reaching a certain level of understanding,
yeah. Sort of
a
like
certain level
piercing
where
that,
we
yeah.
can identify like patterns in like the vocab, like you see so at the end of like certain words or jung obviously or gokup,
Mm.
you see
Mm, it can be all
gup is
sorts
used
of
all
like. I
the
mean,
time.
coop is quite a good one, yeah. Gongu or
Exactly. And
gongu
the thing
or
is like when
whatever.
you know like the hanja, even though there's like multiple hanja for certain readings of obviously Korean, the understanding of hanjas, I could feel like when I see words now, it's easier for me to immediately understand it without a dictionary lookup. Or even
Certainly,
with one dictionary lookup, it's like it sticks in
yes.
my head because I'm like, oh, it's that
You just
hanja
read the
for
hanja, yeah,
that
yeah.
word.
Because
Right,
there's
exactly.
those words right that are kind of sort of bit vague, and the definition is quite long to read. But sometimes all you need to see is
Mm,
just the hanja next to it, and you
it's
get
just
it
the
straight away.
hanja.
For the people who know it, but
Exactly.
obviously people who don't learn it, then they have to read the whole definition and they can still find it troublesome.
And
So yeah, there's that.
you know,
Which
yeah, yeah.
yeah, continue. Yeah,
And something that I was going to ask you was like, I was always wondering like how easy it would be for like Chinese speakers to just like read some Korean Hanja instead of reading like a long Korean definition. Just read the Hanja. Boom, they understand it.
Yeah.
And then like,
Well, I met a few actually while I was in Korea.
oh
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
met a few Chinese speakers, and I don't think I met any Japanese speakers actually. But yeah, the Chinese guys, they usually, what they would do in the Korean classes that I went to, instead of, for all the Westerners, if they didn't know the English word, then they'd write out like a long description in Korean. But for the Chinese guys, every time they just write what it was in Hanja, and then people would just get it straight away. So
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
feel like if you're a native Chinese speaker, then sort of there is no real monolingual dictionary, because obviously, as you know, if you look up in the Korean dictionary,
Right.
it always comes up with Hanja. So you're just kind of,
True.
you're never going to actually get
Just
the
read
real
Hanja,
true
it's like
monolingual,
so
right?
much easier. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, of course, the words aren't always the same. There are like, different variations, because like in China, modern Chinese, they use different words entirely to express the same idea. But
Right.
most of it, you can get the gist. And from what I heard from my Chinese friends, is that a lot of the Korean words are kind of like old Chinese words. So, for example, like sonsengin or sonseng is the word. They don't use that. They don't use those characters per se. They say like lao shu or something, which is like different characters, which might be to do with Korean being taken a hand from the olden days and stuff. But yeah,
Right.
for the most part,
Yeah.
Chinese speakers.
I mean, when you think about it, like 70% of the language comes from these characters. So like pretty much 7 out of 10 words that you see will have Hanja in it. So like learning, understand, like even like okay. So I think both of you are like a little bit. You're a lot much higher of like a Hanja fluency than me. But like for me, where I've studied for a couple months now, going in, I think I can probably read or understand upwards of 400 Hanja now. Just about 400, no more than that. If any more than that, I'm like, I don't know these words. But as far as like the ones you need to know, what are the ones that show up the most frequently? So I mean, you mentioned a couple of them, but where would we say is the best place for people to start when they want to learn Hanja?
Yeah, so I remember a few years ago, there's a site called talktomeinkorean.com, which is like, not Talk to Me in Korean, howtostudykorean.com. That's, so I got the names confused. Where he had a post about like the most important 100 Hanja or something like that. I think that's a good place to start, just to get the very basic ones, just because those are the ones that are most common and the most sort of ones that you need. We can link it down below. But once you get the sort of first sort of 100 out of the way, then I feel like it's up to you whether you actually want to take it seriously. We both advise that it's a very good thing, but if you're not as serious about learning Korean, then I feel like after about the first 50 to 100 or so, then you're probably not going to need to know them, because modern day Koreans, they have to learn all of them in school, sure, but most of them do not remember them unless they're going into law or some sort of field where they might need them. So
like medical or law, right?
Exactly, medicine or law, basically. That's all it is. And you can actually get like a credentials, for learning Hanja. So you can actually take a test in Hanja and be like, oh, I'm this good at Hanja, I'm that good at Hanja, whatever levels they are. Which is quite interesting. But if we want to give a concrete sort of number, I think once you're at the about sort of 500 mark, you're pretty satisfied in terms of like for vocabulary. Of course, every new Hanja helps, but once you're at the sort of 500 mark, you've covered like all the sort of main areas. Because with Hanja, there's like sort of they only get sort of more complicated. They kind of like build on themselves, is what I'm trying to say. So they have like the sort of very basic ones, which you just kind of have to know, memorize straight out. Then you have the sort of intermediate ones, which are like mixtures of these two very bases. And then the most advanced ones are just like mixtures of both the intermediate and the sort of small ones put together. So, and those don't come up as often, so they're less useful. So yeah, if we want to give a concrete number, 500 is my answer to that one. How much you need to know.
500 for a sort of like, okay, if I know 500, I'm pretty much set. I don't need to learn too much more. It's like, for, I guess, as far as, so like there's certain people in the Korean learning community. There's people that are like, you don't need Hanja at all. Like Hanja is useless. There's people that are on that side of the spectrum. And then there are people like yourself and I who are kind of like, oh, Hanja is definitely useful. And Hanja can help boost your understanding and your efficiency when it comes to learning new vocab, especially when we're talking about higher levels of vocab in different fields. But even like outside of just like both spectrums. I think to a certain degree, just understanding like that first like 100 Hanja.
Yeah.
If you're a person who's like, I don't really want to spend too much time on Hanja, I think one of the things that we even talked about once was like, you don't need to like be repping like 50 Hanja cards a day, because like in the Japanese learning like community, what's it called? RTK. Remember the kanji? Like they're doing like they want to like finish understanding all the kanji in like 3 months. So like
because
like
they need it to read. So it's actually
exactly.
There's no one out there saying, "Oh, you don't need kanji." Like, I mean, maybe there is, but
exactly.
Most people agree that you need it to read. So
yeah. So it's like instead we are only like like my recommendation. I'd like to hear yours too. I think you probably only need to do like, not even need to do, but if you want to like start to build your understanding of Hanja to a little bit, I'd say doing like 5 new cards a day in addition to my whatever it is, 10 or 15 like regular Korean cards, and by doing 5 new cards a day, every day you're learning 5 new Hanja, and then by the time 100 days passed, you've studied 500 Hanja, and look at that, you pretty much don't need to worry about learning Hanja after that. Right?
No, it's true, and there are some like other kind of practical uses because it's actually like a cultural thing. People might say, "Oh, wait, which word is that? Is that mulsu or is that whatever su, right? Or is that this Hanja or that Hanja when you're saying this word?" Because unlike, well, I'm not really sure about Chinese and Japanese, maybe they do the same thing, but in written form particularly, you can't actually tell necessarily which Hanja it is unless you know the word already, right? So oftentimes when there's a new word, even when I'm reading books, actually I would say it's very important when you're reading books to at least know the 500, because I learned a new word the other day. I think it was Chonsogu, which is like a pigeon that carries like the letter for someone. And if you don't know the Hanja, then you're not really going to be able to work out what that would have meant. So there are actually very practical uses that people seem to be like denying. Whereas I just can't really say that it's not useful.
Kind of and I think kind of like you were mentioning before, I'll also admit I kind of have an interest in Chinese. Like part of me when I was like studying Korean, I was always kind of interested in Chinese culture, and kind of like I was like, hey, partially through the journey of learning Korean, like you reach like a point where like understanding, when you reach like over like 90% understanding like plus, and you don't really need to do too many lookups, part of my brain was like, oh man, I kind of Chinese sounds cool. So then that's when I started getting a little bit more serious with Hanja, because like it kind of like adds a new like layer to the learning.
It does,
because
you can read it through Korean.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think that was also like a fun thing to just add. I mean, fun if you enjoy it.
Yeah,
if you reach a point where it's like,
yeah,
exactly. And obviously, like you said, right?
No,
you on it.
Oh, you sure? All right, yeah. Well, I had a fun experience recently where I was in Chinatown. In London. There's a Chinatown. I was there with this Korean girl, and she didn't know like that many Hanja, and I was just out here like reading signs left, right, and forward. It's like, hey, do you know how to read that? It's like ton.
Damn.
I just like reading it off, and it's like quite a thing. Like, like
that's funny.
How have I done this? Like, I know something that they don't. So yeah, it can give you an edge if you know enough of it.
Yeah, and I guess part of that, which I guess the arguments that we see on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of people are thinking, hey, Korean people don't know it. Why do I need to know it? And as far as like the way we were talking about like a Chinese learner learning Korean, or just as an individual who want that, it's just like, it's that little bit more like people that have studied Hanja, I think, would understand it. When you know like the background behind words, and you can just see this structure, you see in this word. There's even times where you can like guess what the Hanja is. Like, oh, it's probably this Hanja. Just looking at like the first like 2 parts of the word or so. At least the more context. It's basically just more context towards comprehensibility. I feel.
Yeah, the reason that the Korean people don't know it, and they don't really need to know it, is because, one, first of all, it's a lie. They do know at least about 100. Like, I'm telling you, every Korean person will know at least about 50 to 100. Like, hands down. And second of all, is they already have the context for all the words. So why would they don't actually need to necessarily know the picture.
True.
Because they've already got that. True. They've got way more input on us, that their brain is way more effective at comprehending all these new words and sort of figuring it out. Oh, that might be some different Hanja that I read one time in school. Whereas we have no sort of basis to go off, so it's way more effective for us to actually know them, and we can be on the same level as a Korean speaker just by that. Because it's one thing saying the Korean people don't know them, but they kind of have it in their subconscious on some level, you know. Like
Yeah,
the
exactly.
knowledge is kind of there based on,
Right.
you know, how words are put together in
I
their own
mean,
language. So
they've been living with Korean their entire
yeah,
lives. They already through school. They studied all these words, read it. Their parents speak to them. They talk to friends, etc., etc. And the context they have for learning the language is far beyond what we have. So Hanja is just like the extra step
mm,
to like pushing your comprehension, pushing your brain's ability to kind of like connect with the language. Um,
yeah,
and another thing that we know, like Hanja is also a pretty cool conversation starter. Because
oh
I
yeah,
remember
certainly.
when
They think you're
I was
smart.
on like Hello Talk, and I was just like, I put down one of my favorite phrases. What was it
Like
called?
sajasongo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sajasongo.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah,
sajasongo,
that I
like a
put one of
full.
those down,
Yeah.
and this current like someone texted me. They were like, "Oh my gosh, how do you know Sacha Songo?" And I was like, "Oh, I study it for fun." And then they were like, "Oh my gosh, it's so cool! I study so and so." And then like I had like a 2 hour long conversation just about Sacha Songo with this one person, and like that was super cool. Like I mean, you know, it doesn't get better than that, right? Just like start a
Yeah, I mean,
conversation
hey,
talking about Hanzo, or
they
you know,
definitely think
and
you're smart once
also
you know them. Yeah, they like kind of
sure,
think,
yeah, people
oh,
are like,
he
"Oh
actually
crap,
knows
this dude's
like
smart as
he
hell."
knows what's up. Yeah, I mean, Korean people
Yeah,
are like
yeah.
that anyway. They'd be like, oh yeah, you speak really good, you know, Josh, you know.
Right. But then you got Hanja on top of that. They're like, oh
Oh,
shit.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
next level, next level.
Yeah. Right. And another thing is obviously Korean names.
Oh
Behind
yeah,
pretty much
that is true.
99.99% of Korean names, there are Hanja behind their names,
Definitely.
which has meaning. So
Hmm.
if you actually like ask a Korean person, oh, what's your name? And then they tell you your name. And then like one of the
And
things
they'll
that
tell
I
you which
remember,
one it is, right? Yeah.
yeah, you can ask like, "Oh, is it this?" It's like if someone's
Yeah.
like, My name is like Kim So Jin." You can be like,
Yeah.
"Oh, is it which So or which Jin?"
Gene.
And then
Yeah.
they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, you know like the Hanja behind names." And yeah,
Yeah.
those are really
Yeah.
cool like conversation stories that way too.
It's a cultural thing. Yeah. Just
Exactly, it's a cultural
helps you
thing.
more plugged
Exactly.
in. Yeah, you're more plugged in that way.
Right.
And you know,
Yeah.
when you go to the Pyeongjang, you know, go to the convenience store, you know which flavor of
Right.
ramen you're buying as well because the character for spicy, you know, Shin,
Oh right.
Myoshin,
Oh, that is true.
all of that.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
it
yeah.
does come up. So
Hanja.
yeah.
Yeah. I
So
mean, it's
how
there. It's just hiding. You know.
yeah, right. I was gonna say, so how do we if someone wants to learn Hanja, then how do they go about learning it?
Mm,
What's like I mentioned the website earlier for like the sort of basic ones, but what's your sort of routine for learning them?
right.
Because I know and
Yeah. Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
quite a big
Yeah.
fan of Anki and all this.
Right. Oh, yes. I think the best way to go about learning Hanja, you correct me if I'm wrong, but so there
Hmm.
are a couple of things that I know have been working for me. So I have an Anki deck that I got off of Anki Web, which was basically um, Hanja, Hanjao.
Yeah.
And I took that deck. It had like 3,000 um, cards in it with a bunch of different words in Korean that have Hanja behind them. And then I actually used this add-on, which is called the Migaku Kanji God add-on.
Oh,
It's made by Migaku. It's available for free. It's one of the
oh, it's
Migaku's
free. Yeah.
projects that they've actually recently released. And I basically use that, and it basically it can scan my deck for all the Hanja on my cards, and then I can have it add cards for the Hanja, so that I can learn
So yeah.
the words in my normal deck, and then after I learn the words, I can study the meanings of the individual Hanjas that are broken down in those words, and that's
Ah,
how I've
okay.
been going about it.
So it
Yeah, yeah,
takes
yeah.
it. Yeah. Okay. 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 Yeah. There's one other thing that I would also suggest for people who learn it. Obviously, when you look up in the dictionary, you're seeing them all the time anyway. So you're kind of getting that
Mm,
daily dose
right,
or
right.
daily input you need to sort of just
True.
about
That
remember.
too.
But I was going to say there's also a thing that exists called I can't remember the actual name of the book, but it's like the law, like the actual book of law.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I forget
Um,
the name, but basically that's all written in Hanja. There's one book that's like completely all written in Hanja, which is like the Korean law, like the commit, like
mm,
what do they call it? The amendment in America, or whatever. Like, I don't know how
The Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution. There you go. That's like the Korean Constitution.
Yeah.
Is actually written
Okay.
in Hanja, or there's a version at least that's written in Hanja. So if you guys are really
Oh,
interested, you
okay.
could also find that, if you will. There was also another thing
Yeah.
like gong che, no, not gong che, but something gong yong or something gong yong che, I think it is, where it's basically like mixed script. So they have like novels or whatever's written, but with the mixed script from a while back, like early
Oh,
1900s.
okay.
And that's good for practice as well if you're actually trying to practice reading them, because like newspapers sort of around the Korean War time, maybe a little bit earlier than that, like 1930s or so, they were using Hanja as well,
Right.
mixed in. So,
And you
that's another
know,
good
there's
practice.
also I know a really popular deck that I think you might have recommended to me was, I know
Yeah.
there's the retro Hanja
Oh
deck.
yeah, it's got a lot of
Which
typos in it,
basically
though,
gives,
so be careful.
yeah, yeah, it
You
does
need to
got-
fix the typos. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think he's been updating it, but we can double check on that if.
Well, yeah, we can. Yeah.
But as far as that was a resource that I know is available. But essentially, Anki is a pretty easy way to go about it, because you can just like set it to add 5 new words and then
Yeah, just one at a
5
time.
new Hanja. Just
And
look at it.
yeah,
Um,
I was going to
Yeah.
mention something. Sorry to interrupt, but with your normal Anki reps, what I personally do is normally when you look up a word in dictionary, it comes up with a Hanja as well. What I like to do is add my Hanja to the cards that you're doing for sentence mining.
right.
Because then that way
Right.
you're just getting more exposure to them, and it just helps you piece the words together in the long term. Which is another tip I just want to mention. So yeah, feel free to carry on.
Yeah, and wait, there's the name of this book. I think you were mentioning it's called 날로 먹는 한자.
Oh, there's that one as well.
I'm not sure
That's
if
for
it'll
learners.
zoom.
Yeah. Yes.
it's for
Yeah.
learners. That book, those books are pretty solid because it gives you like a picture and it shows you the Hanja with like a nice, like, it basically helps you learn it through the images, kind of getting used to that structure and stuff. Plus, it gives you examples of words that have the Hanja, which is really useful, so that you can like, oh, that's that's it. What's that mean and stuff. Yeah.
I guess so. So I mean, we've kind of talked about a little bit how they benefit you already.
Yeah,
Is there any other
right.
benefits you'd like to mention, or we can just go on to the next topic? Because I feel like we've pretty much mentioned all the really like good stuff, because we're pretty pro Hanja here. So maybe perhaps we could kind of take it from another side and be like, are there any downsides to putting time into learning Hanja versus just carrying on as normal?
Yeah, let's talk about the downsides /
the cost of entry, the efficiency of it all, really.
Right. So we know, kind of like we mentioned before, Hanja, it's a different language now. Or Hanja, how is Hanja helpful? Where, like, basically the side of the argument that most people are on, the side of the argument why Korean people are telling us not to learn Hanja.
Yeah.
I guess one reason that I can definitely state is, obviously, you pretty much don't necessarily need Hanja to pick up on patterns. Because even before I started learning Hanja, I was able to, like, when I saw Jung, like Jungakyo, that's it.
Yeah.
Or like Jung in general, like you eventually, or Jungshim, Jung. Yeah. When you see that frequently, it's like, oh, it has something to do with the middle. That was something that came to my mind. And then when I learned the Hanja meaning, I was like, oh, it actually does mean the middle, center. And I mean, that'll happen naturally the more you just get familiar with reading. The more you immerse, the more you read.
Yeah, it's the same with any language.
Exactly, right?
You kind of figure out the components naturally as you go along. But I think,
yeah.
Obviously, knowing the Hanja is like helping you kind of boost that faster in terms of like efficiency.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is sort of one thing. Yeah, downside. You may not necessarily need it if you're like not as serious. Because if you don't really care about doing it fast, then you don't really care about putting the extra time in for Hanja, then maybe you could skip on it. I suppose that's like the only sort of real kind of exception that I would say. But and this isn't criticizing anyone. Everyone has their own sort of goals and whatever. But we're out here. I mean, guy like me, guy like Ademola, here to get that kind of high level Korean. So
as
from
far
our
as
point of
like
view,
when
yeah.
we're talking, right? Exactly.
So,
As far as the direction we're coming from, we're
mm,
going for okay, how can we try and like add to this game of Korean? How can we try and
mm,
level up or improve?
anything helps,
While
yeah.
if you, yeah, anything helps,
That's my
right?
sort of
And
mindset, yeah.
Hanja was just that extra
That little extra
piece that we
supplement.
felt was
Mm,
help. But we're
mm,
talking like if a person is very much so, I just want to talk to Korean people. I don't have any interest in Hanja. Will you be missing out? Not necessarily, because for the most part, you
mm.
don't need Hanja to be fluent in Korean.
Yeah, you do
That's
need
the
to kind of
truth,
be
right?
aware of what it is though. Like for like you said
Mm,
earlier with the names, like oh it's I don't know. If
right,
someone says oh it's super im, and then you just be like what are you talking about? Because you wouldn't have
right.
known like
Yeah,
the sort of concept. So you need to
yeah,
be
yeah.
aware of the concept of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but other than that,
Understanding the concept in itself is a good step. But as far as like, you would be missing out on like those pieces of like understanding the deeper meanings behind
mm,
like a person's name or the
right,
deeper
right,
meanings behind certain words, where it came from, or sajasongo, or
exactly,
those
yeah.
kinds of things. Because with an understanding of Hanja, you can you get that connection
Mm.
deeper to the words and the backgrounds, which allows you to be like, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. Or you hear someone's name, you're like, oh, is this name this kind of name? The person's like, oh, surprised that you even understand Hanja in the first place, you know?
Totally, totally. All right. So I think yeah, that pretty
Yeah.
much we had one sort of like bonus question with the whole like traditional simplified just to clarify
Oh,
things, but
right.
I think most people already know what it is. But so yeah, for Korean characters, Hanja obviously was used back in well a long time ago. I don't know the day, but basically it used traditional characters. And they've sort of adopted them and kept the same since, with some very slight
Mm,
variations. But
right.
they're mostly the same with the ones that are still used in Taiwan. So if you were ever
Mm,
to go, I don't know, on holiday to Taiwan from Korea, perhaps, you can rest assured and know that the traditional, they're the same sort of traditional characters that you've learned with your Korean. So you might be able to work something out. I don't know, like a shop name or
right.
something like that, for instance. But yeah, with
Mm,
the good thing about this as well is that going from traditional to simplified is way easier, because you could just sort of work it out without even knowing the simplified one. Whereas going the other way around
mm,
kind of I've heard is more difficult from people in the Chinese community. So yeah, that's another little nice little bit that Hanja has
yeah.
going for it. But yeah, I think is there anything
Right.
else, any other topics you'd like to add, or kind of things, interesting stories that you've had with Hanja or something like that before we end the podcast?
You
Keep
know,
going.
that is pretty much all that I have. I mean, when we're talking
Yep.
about Hanja, our
Hopefully, yeah.
Yoyak, our
Some people got
Kyodai.
something about it. Yeah, like some people
Yeah, if we're going
could
there,
find some
essentially
benefit.
Hanja.
That's our opinion. Yeah.
Thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of the Korean Always podcast. We first of all wanted to give a big thank you to all the people that have sent us DMs and given us a bunch of support. And thank you guys for 50 subs. 50 subs. We
Yeah.
didn't imagine like we'd be hitting this quickly. I mean,
Yeah. It
the
was
love
quite
you guys
quick.
have been showing has been super crazy, and we are really excited to give you guys more content in the future. Um, yeah, as far as that goes, we have a couple. We're planning on doing
Got a little.
interviews with some pretty big names. You know, we
Mhm.
got some big news from George,
Yep,
which
got some
we're going to be
surprises coming
introducing
out.
soon.
Yeah, we can't say too much at the
Yeah,
moment, but
can't say
yeah,
too
we've got a
much
couple of
yet.
things planned. Um, one more thing, I'll let you mention it. I'll let you go and mention the little surprise we got. You don't know what I'm
I
talking
don't remember
about.
the
You don't
surprise.
know what I'm talking about. Okay, guys. So
Uh,
basically,
uh,
we're gonna let me cut that there. No, yeah, we are hopefully going to be releasing a Discord server soon, so you guys can
oh,
get
that's
involved
it.
with our community and hear
Right.
more from us, get updates on our videos, and discuss things that we've discussed about. Maybe disagree with what we say in our videos. All of that
Yeah.
is going to be happening very soon. So we'll
Stay
see when it
tuned.
gets done, but stay tuned.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
All right. That
Yeah,
was
thank
it
you very
for
much
us,
for watching,
guys. We'll
guys.
catch you in the next episode.